So what is big data? Big data is basically an ever-growing stream of information. And this could be anything like photo uploads, likes, Google searches, yeah. And I think the use of big data in society can allow for some pretty amazing discoveries and often propel industries. A prime example would be Google. Actually managed to predict the spread of the winter flu in the US and down to the specific region and state. And they achieved this just by looking at what people had searched for on the internet. And they managed to do this much faster than the Center for Disease Control had ever managed to do in the US. And it just shows that big data can be utilized to achieve some pretty amazing things. This brings me on to an episode of Black Mirror that I watched called Be Right Back. And in this episode, a young woman's boyfriend dies in a car accident, and his name is Ash. And while she's mourning, she gets introduced to this artificial intelligence service, which basically allows people to stay in touch with the deceased. And it did this by using social media profiles, pictures, videos, etc. to sort of create this Ash-like bot that will speak to her, basically. Initially she takes this well because he's so much like the Ash that she knew, and so she sort of gets wrapped into it, and there's an opportunity to enter the next phase that this service provides, and it's quite an experimental phase, and this involved almost uploading all of Ash's data to a synthetic body, which she then activates, and he looks just like Ash. And although he looks just like him, she eventually gets frustrated that he's just a few ripples of Ash. He's not really Ash. He lacks emotions, opinions, the ability to have an argument. All of these things that actually make us a human, he no longer seems to possess. Although this is a fictional example, I think you could still apply the same criticism to big data, you know. Are we no more than our online profiles? Am I no more than what I post on Facebook, what I like on Facebook, what I repost on Twitter? There really are so many more things that make us human, which aren't always accounted for in big data. I believe this is quite a minor criticism of big data, and that ultimately the positives do outweigh the negatives, and this is proven on a very regular basis. Like, I read a news article the other day where a tech company called Infovision, I believe, created the OWL platform. And the OWL platform is basically a screening system that assists doctors in identifying what type of stroke the patient had. And this means they know what treatment to then give the patient, and this is ultimately life-changing. And this is actually why deception occurs so often online, and why it's such a good platform for deception to take base. So just to clarify what deception actually is, it's a message transmitted knowingly by the sender to create or foster false belief or conclusion by the receiver. There are several types of online deception. The most obvious is probably identity-based deception, where you lie about who you are, and this could be anything from age, gender to race. And there are several examples of identity-based deception, which include managerial phishing, spam emails, and they all pretty much involve fraud or conning the receiver out of money. And there's also a more minor form of deception, which happens on a more day-to-day basis, and this is known as message-based deception. And this is where lying or deception occurs during conversation, and this could take place anywhere. It could take place on the phone, on email, instant messaging, even face-to-face. It involves lies like saying you're on your way but you're actually in bed because you've overslept, or telling someone close to you that you like their top even though you really don't. And these lies are often told to preserve the feelings of the receiver. So in comparison to identity-based deception, there's a lot more positive intent. This famous case of Alyssa Jackson, who was a mother of 5 and faked ovarian cancer in order to receive money. She wasn't actually ill. In doing this, she managed to raise £35,000 alongside other donations of clothes and food for her and her children. This is a prime example of identity deception and how it can be used to steal thousands of pounds of innocent people. Another example of identity-based deception, which I think is very famous and very well known, would be the catfish case, where the term actually was coined from. Catfish, which is a 2010 American documentary film. So Nev began speaking to this woman who he actually didn't know, and as they began talking, I think he slowly started to realise that certain things didn't add up. Or she sent him a video of her singing, but he realised it actually sounded just like a famous pop singer. Well, he begins to get suspicious, that perhaps the woman he's speaking to isn't who he thought they were going to be. And so he starts to do his research, starts to endeavour on this journey, and actually does find out that the woman who he had been speaking to wasn't actually that woman, and in fact was a woman of a severely disabled son. And the Facebook fantasies were all she had to really escape that. And a lot of people do find it therapeutic and exciting to engage in identity-based deception, to be someone else for a change, especially when they're not quite satisfied with their own lives. And in this case, there were no malicious intent. So I'm going to talk about the native advertising reading, and I think the main point that's being expressed here is that the use of big data is posing threat to our civic sphere. It's posing threat to the way that we interact with each other and the world around us. And this has already happened around us. I mean, with the rise in cable television in the 80s, leading to the exponential multiplication of available news and entertainment platforms, for the first time introducing segmentation, we no longer had the same information source. We could have several different information sources, and we could choose from what we liked. And for the first time as an audience, we were separate. And this hasn't just gone away. In the 90s and the early 2000s saw the rise of online portals where you could have an endless stream of personalized news, again further fragmenting us as an audience. And in more recent times, the introduction of the smartphone has allowed us to have apps where we can choose what news source we'd like, further endorsing segmentation. And this journal doesn't aim to undermine segmentation, more that it's being overtaken by personalization, which may in the long run be even more powerfully destructive to our civic sphere. Some may say that there are 3 dynamics of content personalization that are causing the world's people see in their digital travels increasingly to diverge depending on points of information that advertisers or publishers carry about them. The first dynamic involves publishers working with advertisers to personalize the commercial messages they receive around the editorial matter. Whereas the second dynamic, which is actually becoming more popular, is what marketers call native advertising. A native ad is textual, pictorial, and or audiovisual material that supports the aims of an advertiser and is paid for by the advertiser, while it mimics the format and editorial style of the publisher that it carries. So a simple example could be a sponsored tweet that is embedded within the constant stream of tweets on one's own timeline. And moving on to the final and third dynamic, we're straying away a bit from advertising and more focusing on the publishers having to keep up with advertising. And perhaps content publishers will have to use data to change their articles and videos on the fly based on what they know of their visitors, which is actually quite difficult. And so while the rise in personalized media and content is working really well for the advertising industry. It's having, I'd say, negative repercussions on the publishing industry. It means that there are declining media audiences, which means there are simply less professionals around. There's not as much of a need for them anymore as there once was. And there's a news article that shows that more than half of the jobs in the news industry have disappeared completely due to online giants such as Google and Facebook gobbling up the ad revenue.